This cycle does not begin with chaos. It begins with imbalance that grows under pressure, institutions that stall under stress, and reforms that arrive too late to rebuild trust. By the time people recognize it as revolution, turning back is no longer realistically possible. France in 1789, Russia in 1917, and Cuba in 1959 followed the same path. Pressure building beneath systems that still looked stable until people stopped believing in them, and authority could no longer rely on consent. In every case, institutions kept operating, even while belief in them weakened. And once that belief shifted, events sped up, and restoring control required force. The system was not willing or able to use. In 2026, the United States is not watching that sequence from the outside. It is already moving through it. Stage 4 is not civil war. It is a slow break inside institutions without open collapse. With debt rising, trust weakening, mobility slowing, and organized challengers gaining strength, while the system still appears stable. That is the position of the United States today. In 1789, France did not look weak. It looked powerful, wealthy, cultured, and militarily strong. And Paris shaped diplomacy across Europe. The monarchy had ruled for 8 centuries, and that long rule created a dangerous belief that long survival meant permanent strength. Under the surface, pressure had already built up. France was divided into 3 estates. The clergy owned land and paid no taxes, and the nobility owned more land and paid almost none. The third estate, made up of peasants, workers, and professionals, carried nearly the entire tax burden. For generations, this imbalance existed without collapse. But what changed was not the structure itself, but how visible it became during crisis. In 1788, harvest failures pushed bread prices sharply higher, and bread already consumed most of a peasant's income. When prices doubled, survival disappeared, and families could not absorb the shock, while the nobility and the monarchy could. Inequality moved from a background reality to daily humiliation, and once survival failed, quiet endurance was no longer possible. Louis XVI faced a shrinking set of choices. France was deeply in debt after years of war, and tax revenue was too low. Real reform required taxing the nobility and clergy, while borrowing protected their privileges but increased dependence on creditors. He chose borrowing, tying the crown to lenders whose patience now controlled timing, and making financial retreat more expensive each month. Relief could no longer arrive early enough to restore confidence. With relief now structurally late, elite loyalty was preserved in the short term, while real reform disappeared. Each loan increased fragility, and each delay deepened resentment among those already paying taxes. As debt grew, even removing privileges would no longer restore balance. It would only reveal how long reform had been postponed. By 1789, the state could not pay its obligations. Credit tightened, and food shortages spread. Louis called the Estates General to legitimize new taxes, believing consultation would stabilize authority. But calling it restored representation in a system that had excluded it for generations. And once representation returned, suppressing it required open force. The Third Estate demanded 1 vote per person instead of 1 vote per estate. Accepting this would weaken noble power, while rejecting it would undermine the assembly. Louis rejected it, forcing the majority to choose between submission and declaring authority themselves. And once they chose the latter, reversal required humiliation they would not accept. On June 17, 1789, the Third Estate declared itself the National Assembly. The declaration shifted legitimacy, as lawyers, merchants, and professionals withdrew recognition from the monarchy. Once legitimacy shifted, the crown could no longer rely on routine obedience and would have to enforce authority directly. When the class that benefits most from stability withdraws support, the buffer between grievance and revolt disappears, and pressure moves directly from hunger to confrontation. Paris reacted. Rumors of repression spread, and crowds moved toward the Bastille. And on July 14th, the prison fell. Guards were killed, and heads were displayed publicly. Once violence became precedent, authority required decisive strength it had already hesitated to use. The monarchy faced another narrowing choice: crush dissent decisively or concede authority. And hesitation achieved neither result. Reforms followed, but hunger remained, and the economy did not stabilize. Moderates could not deliver quick relief, and each failed compromise reduced the chance of gradual settlement. Radicals gained traction because they promised certainty. And as certainty gained support, moderation lost relevance, and restoration became less likely. On January 21, 1793, Louis XVI was executed. Restoration was eliminated, and France could not return to monarchy without rejecting the revolution entirely. With the king dead, authority could only consolidate or fracture, and returning to the old system was no longer possible. The Committee of Public Safety assumed control. Executions increased, and fear became government policy. Once fear ruled, dissent itself threatened the regime. The revolution exhausted France. By 1799, Napoleon seized power, and once military authority consolidated, reversing it required dismantling the state again. Russia, 1917. The Romanov dynasty had ruled for 3 centuries, and the empire stretched across continents. Beneath it, the structure mirrored France. The Tsar and nobility controlled vast resources, while peasants and industrial workers endured constant scarcity. And the imbalance lasted because enforcement held and expectations remained limited. Nicholas II believed reform threatened divine authority. In 1905, peaceful demonstrators asked for change, and they were shot. Trust weakened. Not enough to topple the regime immediately, but enough to erode it. And without reform, loyalty would keep declining. World War I intensified the pressure. Millions died, supplies failed, and soldiers lacked equipment. Each defeat drained loyalty. Nicholas chose to continue the war, tying the regime's survival to military success he could not guarantee. Each additional loss reduced the army's willingness to enforce internal order. By early 1917, breadlines stretched through Petrograd, and women protested and workers joined, and troops were ordered to fire. They refused. Enforcement collapsed, and authority existed only on paper. Without leverage, abdication became the outcome, and Nicholas stepped down, ending the Romanov line and removing continuity. So restoration would require reimposition rather than inheritance. A provisional government promised reform and elections. It inherited collapse and war. It chose to remain in the conflict, tying legitimacy to a war the population rejected. Promises now depended on outcomes it could not control. Legitimacy dissolved within months, and without it, reform carried no authority. Lenin offered peace, land, and bread, and his movement was organized and support shifted. As support shifted, the provisional government lost the ability to govern even where it formally retained power. On October 25, 1917, the Bolsheviks seized key institutions and authority transferred in less than a day. Counteraction required coordination. The government no longer possessed, and resistance fragmented. Civil war followed, executions multiplied, and famine spread. Once civil war began, moderation had no mechanism to reassert itself. Russia collapsed when war exposed incompetence, and organized alternatives were ready before authority fully broke. Cuba, 1959. Havana projected prosperity with casinos, tourism, and investment, but wealth was concentrated among elites tied to Batista. Rural poverty persisted, and corruption was visible, and that visibility reduced tolerance. Batista seized power in 1952 and canceled elections. He chose repression, and each act expanded opposition and required continuation because easing it would expose weakness without restoring trust. Castro attacked in 1953 and failed. Imprisoned, released, regrouped. He returned with 82 men. Most were killed, and he survived, and survival turned failure into a powerful symbol. Batista increased repression as villages were destroyed and torture spread fear and resentment. Reconciliation required admitting guilt, so repression continued. As the United States pulled away, external backing weakened. Enforcement capacity shrank, and the margin for error disappeared. Desertions increased, and Batista fled. Central authority collapsed, and restoration required force he no longer possessed. Castro entered Havana, promising democracy, and opposition was arrested and property was nationalized. Executions followed. Once property was nationalized, reversing the system required dismantling the new regime. 3 centuries, 1 progression. The United States in 2026 does not resemble those countries in architecture, uniform, or climate. Revolutions are not triggered by appearances, and they are triggered by structural alignment. Begin with wealth concentration. In 1980, the top 1% controlled roughly 8% of national wealth. Today, it exceeds 30%, and the top 0.1% hold more wealth than the bottom 90% combined. For decades, rising markets hid the divergence, and asset growth replaced wage growth. Cheap credit replaced reform, deepening dependence on asset prices and making falling markets more destabilizing. The system did not correct divergence, it turned it into market performance. Housing unaffordable, lower rates, student debt rising, expand lending, and healthcare climbing, add subsidies. Each intervention delayed the pain, increasing the scale and cost of future correction. Borrowing replaced adjustment, and delay compounded. Federal debt exceeds $36 trillion. Deficits persist and entitlements expand. Interest consumes revenue, reducing flexibility. Policymakers face narrowing options: raise taxes and risk capital flight, cut spending and risk backlash, or inflate and risk currency credibility so obligations are pushed into the future. That is constraint management. Trust in Congress is near historic lows. Media trust splits along partisan lines, and Supreme Court trust declines. Roughly half the country disputes the 2020 election, and the other half sees January 6th as an attempted coup. These are incompatible realities, and without shared legitimacy, compliance depends on factional loyalty. Courts are viewed as political, and the FBI as political, and elections as manipulated. When outcomes are questioned before votes are cast, procedural democracy weakens regardless of legality. This is belief erosion. Upward mobility once defined American identity. Today, housing affordability collapses relative to wages. Student debt delays family formation. Healthcare costs rise faster than income, and asset ownership rather than labor now drives wealth. When work no longer guarantees stability, participation begins to feel conditional. Young professionals are educated yet constrained, and stagnation reduces patience for slow reform. When the educated middle class loses confidence, frustration moves from private concern to political conflict, and neutrality becomes difficult. Frustration looks for targets, and targets become narratives. Political polarization intensifies. On the left, calls grow for redistribution and structural overhaul, and on the right, Calls grow for stronger executive authority and extra-legal enforcement. Opponents become existential threats, and moderates lose ground. Compromise mechanisms weaken. When politics becomes zero-sum, survival gridlock intensifies, and the window for resolution shrinks. Modern governments collapse not because they lack power, but because they lose legitimacy while still exercising it. The United States continues functioning. Markets trade, elections occur, and courts rule. Yet debt grows, trust declines, mobility slows, polarization intensifies, and the margin for error narrows. This is Stage 4. Institutions still function, but legitimacy no longer stabilizes them. Stage 5 begins not with mobs, but with organization. France had Jacobins, and Russia had Bolsheviks, and Cuba had the 26th of July movement. Each formed while institutions still operated. In the United States, movements exist across extremes, not dominant, but organized and funded. As belief grows that reform is impossible, reform narratives weaken. If economic contraction combines with contested legitimacy, pressure increases. And if supply chains weaken, capacity shrinks. If a catalytic event occurs during widespread distrust, alignment accelerates. The kindling is already present. Stage 5 requires mass support for organized alternatives. That threshold has not yet been crossed, but the conditions that allow it are visible. Once mass support forms, concessions stop buying time and instead confirm replacement. Stage 6 resembles fragmentation. France saw execution and war. Russia saw civil conflict and purges. And Cuba saw exile, imprisonment, and dictatorship. In a modern nuclear power, fragmentation would follow the same structural logic, with contested authority, fractured, enforcement, disruption, and consolidation by whoever restores order fastest. France believed in tradition, and Russia in dynasty, and Cuba in prosperity. Yet belief did not stop structural convergence. The pattern narrows probability. Wealth concentration is high, debt rising, institutional trust fractured, the middle class constrained, and political extremes gaining confidence. That alignment defines Stage 4. Reform is theoretically possible, but it requires voluntary sacrifice from those who benefit most, and rapid restoration of trust. History shows how rarely those conditions align under pressure. 3 revolutions followed the same sequence, each believing collapse was impossible until it became irreversible. The pattern moves through accumulated pressure rather than sudden emotion. The United States now stands at the same structural junction. Stage 4 is not collapse, but the narrowing of escape routes. History shows that once the window narrows enough, events move faster than consensus can form. The warning signs are structural. If Stage 5 consolidates, reversal becomes exponentially harder. France, Russia, and Cuba each believed they were different. Each followed the sequence. That is where the United States stands today. Inside the pattern, and the pattern does not wait for comfort.